Story 1. I was in a group known as Amway for 2 months. I learned that they love to dress in formal business attire and sit and listen to successful people talk for hours. They put on a facade about how much they care about you and creating a friendship with you until you open your eyes and realize they only care about you because you can help them earn more money. God forbid you miss a phone call, or else they think you aren't committed to your business. They try to convince you that if you listen to 3 audios of people speaking each day, you'll become successful. Once a week, in my experience, we met in a hotel conference room from 7 p.m. until 10 p.m., listening to the same pitch, and they expected you to take notes every single time. Then, every month, they hosted gatherings called Night Owls where we would meet at a location. Ours was Pizza Ranch. You paid $10 to enter, and you sat, ate, and listened to so-called successful people talk until 3 a.m. The moment I realized I needed to leave the group was when I was giving my pitch to a friend via text, and he said I sounded like I was using an AI text generator to communicate with him. Needless to say, if anyone ever approaches you asking if you're open to making additional income, say no. Story 2. I was in a wellness community for 3 years. They started by telling us to drink special green juice every morning, but it got darker. Eventually, they isolated us from family, took our phones, and made us work 18-hour days in their healing gardens. The leader claimed she could cure cancer with meditation. I left when I saw them forcing a diabetic girl to stop her insulin. I called my sister at 2 a.m. from a gas station payphone and never looked back. Story 3. No business dealings. No holidays. No Friday night fun, nor Saturday until after sunset. No dating. No unclean meat. Holy days are observed for a week without leavened products. Go to school with your sandwich made on matzo and listen to the kids make you feel very strange. Men are in authority, while women and children are considered beneath them. God comes first. Violence against women is blamed on the woman. At 18 or 19, I finally left. Now at 54, my father still believes I turned away from God and ruined my life. Story 4. Not really escaped so much as it collapsed. It was a large church, and the pastor would deliver a sermon. Then the recording would be played in each branch of the church multiple times every Sunday morning and evening. Backstory on how I got in: I married young. He was saving himself for marriage and had never even held a girl's hand. He was from a Russian community, so I learned the language and immersed myself, even though it was an American church in the United States. He took me to this church, and we got involved and attended a premarital class together. The classes became awful. They insisted on successful marriages looking only one way and said that if we didn't meet certain expectations, our partners would cheat on us. While that logic may have some merit, the methodology is where I take issue. It essentially sent the message to suppress feelings and character to bow to your husband. We were told not to question anything and that there was only one path to achieve a successful marriage. Additionally, we were instructed to give money and live modestly, even though the pastor wore fancy clothes. Then we started attending redemption classes and buying the pastor's books. Men and women participated separately. Essentially, they would break you down and then offer you psychological relief. I remember a woman in her 50s who was sobbing, recounting a childhood incident where she engaged in inappropriate play with a younger child, saying it made her a terrible person. The leader of our group kept forcing her to rehash the memory in a twisted way. I told her not to try to justify the actions of a child with the reasoning of an adult, pointing out that when she was 6 years old, there were no inappropriate desires involved, not even in her memory of the event. The leader became angry and shut me down, trying to convince this woman that she would suffer eternally for this incident unless she followed specific actions prescribed by that church. Even I could see what was happening. I reminded the woman that none of us were licensed counselors or therapists, after which I was asked not to speak for the remainder of that session. The same happened with my first husband, my fiancé at the time. Apparently, in his group, he admitted to inappropriate behavior with his cousin when he was about 7 or 8 years old. They pressured him and convinced him that what he did was wrong, and even though post-puberty he had never desired relationships with men, he needed to feel guilt and repent, believing only they could lead him to redemption. He experienced a moral crisis and drove for 10 hours to calm himself down, making the trip throughout the night without sleep. Poor guy. I held on to my identity and pushed back against them. When they would start group criticism sessions, I would always bring in reality checks and eventually stopped attending the meetings. Well, our marriage fell apart. The church and his family convinced him I was the problem. Oddly enough, around the same time, the entire large church crumbled, and the pastor was dismissed due to a scandal, reportedly for publishing some horrific literature on female subordination. Every branch of his church was sold off in 2014. I have seen him now trying to make a comeback, but I don't think it has taken off. As for me, I moved overseas. My therapy is riding my horse across the rolling fields, and I am happily remarried and raising a son. Edit. Oh wow, there's a documentary on it. The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. Story 5. A significant amount of spiritual, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse is present, along with greed, racism, and a tendency to look down on those who are not part of it. I escaped the physical and sexual abuse, but it still left me with a deep mistrust of religious authorities. Story 6. We turned into a cult. It happened so subtly and slowly that we had no idea. It was a gradual shift to only spending time with people in our group and a teaching not to trust those outside, to listen to the leaders, and to view any ideas or words from outside the group with suspicion. When the police came to remove my underage sister, that was the awakening that made us see how far we had gone. Story 7. I was in a band with someone who left a cult. The band dissolved as a result. Everything was prescribed by the cult leader and the senior members. His clothing, job, lifestyle, and associations were all controlled by them. He couldn't function in regular reality and slowly unwound afterward. He is a really amazing guitar player. It was a Pixies tribute band back in the 1990s, which is such a bummer. I dropped a link to an album he played on below. Enjoy! I won't tell you which one, but it features songs that sound like the guitar player just escaped from a cult. Story 8. I grew up in an evangelical environment. I was taught to inform school shooters that I was a Christian so I could die for my faith. We were also severely oversexualized. Girls were taught that men couldn't control themselves around women, while boys were taught that we were controlled by our sex drive. Additionally, we were taught how evil sex was. Do not get me started on the judgment. Story 9. Does the fundamentalist Christian group count as a cult? I'm still processing everything. Can you have a life without shame? So how? This is a deep question. Additionally, when we say we value others but then actively take away opportunities or programs that would help them, how is that loving our neighbor? It's overwhelming. I am very glad I walked away. Story 10. I was raised in one school. Christian dominionism, rapture theology, young earth creationism, biblical inerrancy. I was a Jesus camp kid. I also attended a youth group in a different flavor of evangelicalism, one that was starting to tip towards the Gotthardites. It's complicated, but my mother was diagnosed with cancer when I was 4. The satanic panic had done enormous psychological damage to her, as she was almost certainly autistic with an abnormally strong fixation on sin and hell. She did not want her children in a Catholic school, as she had been raised Catholic and was scarred by her obsessive confessing to trespasses. She chose a school that taught the Abika curriculum out of Pensacola Christian College. She died when I was 6, at which point the cult had already told me the story of Lazarus and the rich man. You can see out of heaven the suffering in hell, but as there is no unhappiness in heaven, if I didn't stay in the cult, my mother would see me burning in hell and be happy about it. When I was almost 8, I made friends with some kids in a different church. They were more afflicted with active purity culture than my school, which mostly just acted like anything involving sex didn't exist. We had to focus much more on fighting demons and protecting our hearts from Satan. I was told in both communities that abortion is not just murder, but literal human sacrifices to Satan. I was told in both that Democrats were literally blood-drinking, baby-murdering, child sex trafficking monsters. My father, who didn't care much about what I was being taught, pulled me out of the school in 8th grade because he realized I needed to graduate from an accredited school to go to college. The fact that my foundational education in everything but reading was done inadequately, if not with outright lies, was ignored. Because I was removed from the cult, it had a harder time holding me long-term. It took a long time to realize it was a cult. My older sister was violent, and my father was neglectful where he wasn't exploitative. I used to pray daily for the rapture because I was sure my sister was going to eventually murder me in a rage, and I didn't want my father to have to live with that. Somewhat ironically, my sister realized many of the teachings of the cult made no moral sense. It took me a lot longer to reach the same conclusions because she was so violent that I could not believe she would figure out morals and ethics. Story 11. Ex-Church of Christ here. Attendance is strictly monitored. You are expected to be present for every service. If you miss often, there may be unspoken judgment regarding your absence. Questioning the authority of the elders or the preacher is discouraged. You are primarily expected to answer the questions posed in Bible class. If you are a woman, you are often expected to remain silent, even in Bible class. You are expected to feel guilt about your sins and to outwardly demonstrate this by coming forward at the end of the sermon to request the congregation's thoughts and prayers. You are to follow the teachings of the Bible strictly. You should not engage in any practices not explicitly mentioned in the Bible or demonstrated by early Christians. Engaging in behavior explicitly prohibited by the Bible is not allowed. You are expected to conform and be part of the congregation. You should dress, act, and behave like everyone else, especially imitating the elders, who are regarded as the shepherds of the congregation. Men are expected to participate in the congregation through activities such as leading songs, preaching, leading prayers, and serving the Lord's Supper. Women are expected to remain silent and are limited to teaching children's Bible class, preparing the Lord's Supper, and cleaning the building. Engagement in worship involves singing, a cappella, where everyone participates, praying silently or personally during prayers, and partaking in the Lord's Supper. Story 12. On the first day of joining this church, when it came to giving offerings, the pastor asked the ushers to lock the doors so that everyone could contribute. Story 13. They praised the leader and regarded his words as fact, no matter how outrageous his lies. He had several wives and treated them all poorly. The entire group wore red ball caps. Story 14. I was expecting many. I wasn't in a cult myself, but type answers, but the number of first-hand accounts in this thread is a bit distressing. Story 15. I left the Roman Catholic Church. I was raised in a Catholic school and became an altar server as soon as I was allowed. I attended church willingly 5 days a week and dedicated much of my free time to serving masses. For years, I considered becoming a nun. As a child, I used the church as a form of escapism to cope with my extremely abusive family. However, in my teenage years, I began to question why such things were overlooked by God. I noticed hypocrisies within the teachings and experienced punishment from my teachers for asking clarifying questions about the Bible instead of receiving answers. By the age of 17, I actively stopped participating in church functions and grew to despise the Catholic Church. This was incredibly hard for me because my family is deeply devoted to Catholicism. By 28, I started to see more and more hypocrisies. I attended a few masses out of respect for my family when visiting them in the church where I grew up. I listened to a priest, a man I once held a Bible for as a child, preach about God's love for all, only to hear him claim that God only loves the just and those who are worthy. Seeing everyone around me nodding was a moment of true realization. I began to observe my own family's hypocrisies. They all claimed to be devoted Catholics, yet in reality, they were selfish, greedy, abusive, hateful, jealous, and covetous. I also began to notice the luxuries of the churches, which did little to help the needy or the poor. Now in my 30s, I realize how cult-like the Catholic Church is. Therapy has uncovered many religious wounds, and I am left with a significant amount of trauma from my experiences. I have a strong dislike for Catholicism as a whole. Story 16. I have a friend who escaped from a troubled teen industry cult called Kids of Bergen County, later known as Kids of North Jersey. He was stuck there from ages 15 to 20. It was meant to be a treatment facility, but unlike the typical cases, he was labeled a behavior problem. He ran away from home one night and drank a beer with some other teens. No matter how much he complied with the program, they would not allow him to graduate. Similar to Lulu Corder, someone he actually knew from the program. Look up her case if you want to learn more. His mother was fully integrated into the cult to the point that by the time he escaped, she was working as an assistant to the founder, and his father was a true believer until he eventually abandoned them and remarried. I talked to him frequently about his experiences. There were many cult-like behaviors, such as time spent singing songs, food and sleep deprivation, and motivation, which involved waving your arms intensely instead of raising your hand to speak during group therapy sessions. There were also oddly puritanical rules like prohibiting certain types of music and strict guidelines about interactions with the opposite sex. They spent all day oversharing, revealing every possible guilty behavior from their past, real or imagined, and criticizing each other, looking for inconsistencies in their stories or a lack of enthusiasm in telling them, constantly droning on about how the program was saving their lives. Those who bared their souls received affection, warmth, and advancement in the program's phases. In the early phases, family contact was limited, attendees were taken out of school, and their diet consisted solely of peanut butter and jelly. A higher stage member, referred to as an old comer, would follow them around, holding their belt loops. In later phases, they could see their families more often and return to school. His escape stories are quite remarkable. They would send parents and other cult members to search for escapees on foot, often collaborating with local law enforcement. He once escaped during a higher phase by opening a window and daring his newcomer to jump through it. After baiting him, my friend jumped through first, leaving the newcomer surprised. However, he was later caught when he got lost in the dark and fell asleep in someone's yard. The police picked him up and returned him to his parents, placing him back in the first phase of the program. Years later, during his third escape attempt, he managed to break free by judo chopping the hands of the person holding his belt loops and fleeing. He lost his pursuers, got as far away as possible, and found a payphone. He had memorized the number of a friend whose parents had released him from the program, and thankfully they came to pick him up, starting his life as a free man. I considered compiling his stories into something publishable, but I stopped interviewing him when I realized that reliving his trauma was triggering. He often experienced night terrors and dreams of being trapped there after our conversations. That center eventually shut down in the late 1990s, and the cult leader Virgil Miller Newton went on to become a Greek Orthodox minister in Florida. Unfortunately, places like it are still out there, especially in states like Utah. There's too much money to be made. Notable investments have come from firms like Bain Capital, which acquired several troubled teen industry centers. Story 17. A guy I knew a while back wanted to start a cult and forced my friend and me to join. He wanted to become the next dictator so he could conquer other countries and form his own empire, like the Romans had. He was very verbally abusive toward my friend and me, and would threaten to send armed men to our houses, though he had no idea where either of us lived and didn't have anyone to send. He'd also make up horrible stories about people we knew that he didn't like, but luckily none were true, to try to scare us. My friend and I ended up cutting him off and haven't heard anything from him in almost 10 years. Story 18. We had to worship this supernatural space entity who supposedly sent a version of himself to Earth so that people would kill him. Then we had to drink his blood. Story 19. So you do not think I am making this up. There was a lot of spiritual abuse and various forms of child abuse that were not covered in the articles. I was forced to work without pay as a child and was never compensated. Children were locked in rooms. People were coerced into converting to a version of Roman Catholicism. I was not taught math, science, or an accurate version of history, and was told it was my fault for having an inadequate education. I would rather not delve into the sexual abuse, other than to say many children who were sexually abused were forced to apologize to their abusers and were shamed. These were literally children too young for a learner's permit or to work. While the staff were not regularly beating students, as far as I know, they did hit or shove students at times and looked the other way when students assaulted each other, even encouraging it on occasion. Stalking people who considered leaving was encouraged. I know multiple individuals who were stalked after they left, and some were shunned. Regarding book banning, no books, movies, or music were officially banned from campus during my time there. However, if a staff member disliked a particular item, you could be screamed at or trapped in lengthy conversations where no explanation was good enough. Even if your parents were fine with it, you could find yourself alone with that staff member, or multiple students would gang up on you. Sometimes students were left alone on campus. I recall once being trapped in a room, screamed at, and told I would get pregnant for sleeping over at a male friend's house, even though both our parents were fine with it. We simply watched movies and played video games. I am literally gay, but they did not know that. The children and godchildren of the staff were favored, as were the founding students. It was as if they could do no wrong. There was a period of 6 to 1 year where the campus had no hot water. The staff refused to fix it and made the students arrange for repairs to teach us a lesson. We had no school nurse. There was something called tribunal, where we could be trapped in a room for 6 to 8 hours a day and questioned. I still have nightmares about this, and I suspect many others do too. The room always had a foul odor because one of the staff members had poor hygiene. If you experience this, you know who I am referring to. There is much more, and someday I might do an Ask Me Anything. Perhaps next month. Story 20. Several years ago, I had a severe drinking problem that landed me in the hospital with a blood alcohol level of 0.53. I aspirated into my lungs, ended up in a coma, and then spent 2 weeks in the intensive care unit. I swore off drinking after that. My former church convinced me to go to a place called Teen Challenge. I could fill pages with the atrocities I witnessed there. I gave up my large 2-bedroom apartment with vaulted ceilings, let my new truck get repossessed, signed guardianship of my son over to his grandparents, and so on. I left after 3 months because it was so bad. There were outright lies, food that was spoiled and refrozen, and roadkill served as meals after a deer car accident. I could go on and on. I ended up homeless, drinking under a bridge after my ex-wife came and got me. Now, almost 3 years later, I am sober, have my son back, am engaged, and am getting licensed as a builder again. I am also a full-blown atheist. If anyone wants to know, I can provide detailed examples of how horrible it was. If I had dug deeper than the first page of Google, I would have never gone there. Story 21. I left the Christian religion years ago and couldn't be happier. I found their incessant chanting, incantations, and worship of an unseen supernatural being to be extreme and delusional. Story 22. They stood at a pew, had us chant from books, read from a black book, dumped us in water, made us give them money, and told us we were still going to hell. Baptists are strange. Story 23. The boyfriend of one of my closest friends, to be exact, comes from a family that's part of a cult known as the Ecclesiastical Church. Translated word for word to English, that would be the Church of Ecclesias, though I don't know if you have your own name for them, as this cult originated in a free country. Basically, if you do not fully commit your life to the cult, you are considered corrupted by the evil of the world and treated like a tumor in human form. To the cult members, you are not only a lost soul, but simply being around you could corrupt innocent people who are still following God's path. As a result, you become a total outcast, which, in their opinion, is what you deserve for your sinful ways. Want to know one of the worst sins imaginable to them? Being gay. My friend is female, but her boyfriend is bisexual and has dated guys before. You should have seen the reactions of his parents and siblings when they found out about this. Judging by the look of disgust on their faces, you would think he just proudly proclaimed that he likes to harm children. Story 24. Yes, Amway. I joined it for 1 day and realized how problematic it was and left. The business structure and all the pyramid level talk made it clear to me what the code was and how to recognize another fellow Amway member. It was the mouthwash spray. Every single Amway member had a mouthwash spray. Story 25. I was in a Naddle-fed cult for 5 years. They were abusive. They convinced people to leave their families, quit their jobs, and work 13-hour days for them, 365 days a year. While they never laid a finger on you, those sworn into their secret political party faced severe mental torture. I had a friend there who spent over 12 hours in a meeting where they made her write essays about how she was selfish for wanting to visit her family. Regularly, they held meetings to criticize newer members into submission. They forced everyone to follow a vegan diet. They believed cell phones were spying devices and tried to eliminate them. However, they did not immediately put you in this position. They posed as a charity before asking more and more of you, slowly brainwashing you as you gave more time. Story 26. I was in an actual psychosis-induced or shared psychosis cult where I was manipulated and love-bombed by the leader to stop taking over 5 very strong antipsychotic medications and selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors cold turkey at the naive young age of 15 to 16. Eventually, I ran away from home for over a week with the plan of heading towards Washington, D.C. to assassinate Donald Trump. Long story short, he made me believe I was something called a gray angel, half human and half angelic being, and had multiple past lives, claiming we were soulmates, among other things. There was one other person involved, and we almost committed acts that would have left me in regret for the rest of my life. A tip for all of this: teen girls, this is for you. Don't listen to older men or boys who tell you they are the only ones who understand you and that you can only trust them. They are isolating you from your friends and family, instilling a sense of trust so you become vulnerable, allowing them to learn more about you and use that information against you. Also, always take your medications on time. Story 27. What I would like to ask them is whether hearing opposition from their family and loved ones entrenched them further in the group, and if they believe they would have recognized it sooner without that pressure. Story 28. This and this. Story 29. Circumcised, baptized, confirmed, and forced to be an altar boy. So I stole a lot of money from collections. Story 30. The individual is good. The individual is great. You will surrender free will as of this date. Leader. Story 31. I was a Democrat for years, then left when they became too cult-like to become an independent. I can't stand most Democrats or Republicans. Story 32. Nothing to escape, really, but I decided to leave feminism when I realized it had become cult-like and hateful. If you went against their views or challenged them, you were considered the enemy, spreading false information, with people repeating the same things over and over, despite not knowing if they were true or understanding their meanings. They often claim that things are misogynistic, but when you ask them to define it, they say that it is misogynistic to ask. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.